Hey, I'm Andrew Connell. What you're about to watch is the overview lesson to one of the chapters in my MS-600 exam prep guide course. This course is available for purchase on my site, voitanos.io. I'll include a link to it in the description below the video. This overview video, which is the first lesson of the chapter that you selected, gives you an idea of what the chapter is going to cover. You can learn more by checking out the description below the video about this chapter. If you've got any questions about the chapter or the course, just drop a comment below the video and I'll be sure to get back to you. So with that, let me get out of the way. Enjoy the overview lesson from this chapter. Hello and welcome back. In this chapter, I'm going to focus on the workload called Extend Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams is an important topic to Microsoft, and it originally only accounted for just 15 to 20% of the questions on the exam. And after getting bumped up in November of 2022's update for the exam, Microsoft really went all in, and they clearly made this a Teams-centered exam and associated certification with the August 2022 update. Microsoft Teams is an extensible platform that you can create custom apps on. Apps for Microsoft Teams can be as simple or as complex as you need, from sending notifications to channels or users to complex multi-surface apps, incorporating conversational bots, natural language processing, and embedded web experiences. You can build apps for an individual, your team, your organization, or for all Microsoft Teams users everywhere. Now, this workload accounts for 30 to 35% of all the questions in the question pool that could show up when you take this exam. And this is the most heavily weighted workload when it comes to the number of questions that you'll see on the exam. And in fact, you could argue that it's even more than that after the August 2022 update. Microsoft not only moved some of the questions out of the Teams workload and into other workloads, but they also introduced two new workloads that each account for 5 to 10% of the questions on the exam that are quite slanted towards Microsoft Teams. Teams is the most important product to Microsoft 365 these days, and it gets all of the attention. So not surprisingly, Microsoft is using the certification associated with the MS-600 exam to reflect this importance as well. And in fact, in the August 2022 update, they even renamed the certification from the Microsoft 365 Developer Associate certification to the Microsoft 365 Teams Application Developer certification. Now that you know what Teams is and how much of the exam it accounts for, let's look at the depth of knowledge that you're going to need to have in these various areas. Recall that from Bloom's taxonomy from the overview chapter in this course. Let's use that to provide some context around what you need to know, because it helps to understand how deep you need to know something before embarking on studying for that topic. This helps you grasp the level of questions that you'll see in the exam. Now, when you look at the skills checklist that Microsoft provides for the MS-600 exam, you'll notice that most skills include the following words: describe, identify, use, create, add, and implement. These phrases fall across the entire spectrum of the taxonomy. That means that for Microsoft Teams, we're going to focus on the entire pyramid of the taxonomy, all the way from the lower order thinking skills like remember and understand, all the way to a higher order thinking skill like evaluate and create. Let's now take a minute to explore what lessons that you're going to find in this chapter so that you know what to expect as you proceed through the Microsoft Teams chapter. In this current overview lesson, you've learned what the Microsoft Teams workload is all about. In just a minute, I'm going to wrap up this lesson with some additional learning resources, so be sure to check the notes for this lesson under the video for a collection of all the external references that I use throughout this chapter. The Microsoft Teams workload is important to Microsoft 365 and, as I previously mentioned, is reflected in the MS-600 exam pool questions. But you don't need to know everything about this topic in order to pass the exam. So, in the next lesson, I'm going to call out specific things that you need to focus on, as well as things that you can ignore as they aren't relevant to the exam. We'll then begin with a look at an overview of the custom Microsoft Teams apps, as that's the focus of this workload. And in this lesson, we're going to look at some of the common aspects of creating custom apps for Microsoft Teams, such as app manifests, app packages, and the different deployment options. And then I'm going to kick off a handful of lessons on the various extensibility things that you're going to be tested on, including creating an app manifest for your app using the developer portal for Teams, task modules, which are really just dialogues in Microsoft Teams, tabs, both personal and channel or group tabs, These used to be called static and configurable tabs for those who aren't familiar with these terms. And then we're going to look at webhooks, messaging extensions, bots, including conversational bots, calling bots, and online media bots. And finally, a custom app for meetings, also referred to as a meeting extension. And just like all the other chapters in this course, I'm keeping the depth of explanation to the level of what you need to know in order to pass the exam. I'm trying not to go too deep with my explanations because this is an exam prep course. It's not intended to teach you everything about the topic. There are plenty of other resources available that you can leverage if you aren't familiar with a particular topic. When I cover something in the course, you may think, okay, I got it. I'm comfortable with my knowledge on this topic. But if you think to yourself, I don't get it, or you aren't familiar with a process or an API that I'm covering, you should go read the official docs or study one of the multiple resources that I'm referencing throughout the course to make sure that you are adequately familiar with the topic prior to taking the exam. Now, I'm going to reference specific resources throughout the course, but like I said, be sure to check the notes for this lesson under the video for a collection of all the external resources that I'm going to use throughout this chapter. But on this slide, I quickly want to run through the Microsoft Learning resources that I'm providing and explain what's in each one of these. The first group of links is around Microsoft Learning. They have Microsoft Learning paths and modules. A learning path is just a collection of modules that are all strung together. The learning path for Microsoft Teams is called Develop Apps for Microsoft Teams Associate, and it contains the modules used for self-paced study to study for the exam. And then we have some modules that cover various topics that I'll reference throughout the chapter. They all contain hands-on labs if you want to practice some of the topics that you need to be familiar with prior to taking the exam. These modules are things like Introduction to Building Apps for Microsoft Teams, Task-Oriented Interactions in Microsoft Teams with Messaging Extensions, Create Embedded Web Experiences with tabs for Microsoft Teams, Create Interactive Conversational Bots for Microsoft Teams, Collect Input in Microsoft Teams with task modules, Connect Web Services to Microsoft Teams with webhooks and Office 365 connectors, Create Interactive Meeting Apps for Microsoft Teams as well. Microsoft Teams contains a ton of documentation as well on their site. Now I'm going to reference a bunch of individual links in the lesson notes, but you can always start at their docs homepage. Now, what about what you do and don't need to know? Unlike the other chapters where I might break this discussion into its own lesson, I'm going to include it here in the overview lesson. This discussion doesn't really warrant its own lesson. Why? After the initial release of the MS-600 exam in late 2019 and then the refreshes in November of 2020 and August 2022, there aren't many things to tell you to avoid. When it comes to specific product features, I'm not going to enumerate what things you do or don't need to know in this lesson. Instead, I'm just going to say that if I don't cover it in this chapter, it's not covered in the exam. I'm taking this approach in this chapter, which is a little bit different from the other chapters, because Microsoft is iterating and adding features to Microsoft Teams at such a rapid pace. They've also shown to update the MS-600 exam more frequently for this workload than all the other workloads. So my promise to you is that I'll keep this chapter updated if I see something new get added to the MS-600 exam. Now, on the topic of tools and SDKs, you should be familiar with the JavaScript and TypeScript APIs primarily. Now, while there are plenty of .NET touchpoints related to Microsoft Teams, like with the bot framework and all the Microsoft Learning content and any questions that show code, they're all going to favor JavaScript and TypeScript and Node over .NET code. The MS-600 exam won't ask you to create any projects, so the tooling you prefer to use won't really matter when it comes to the exam questions. Microsoft Learning modules mostly favor the Yo Teams Yeoman generator, but I'd expect over time that we'll see those modules get revised to use the Teams toolkit. Okay, that wraps up the overview lesson. And in the next lesson, I'm going to cover the common topics, custom Microsoft Teams apps that you need to be familiar with before taking the MS-600 exam. So I'll see you in the next lesson.